Terminator Resistance is a blast from the past on multiple levels. It's a game that manages to capture the very essence of the old school sci-fi franchise that it's based on, yet I'm not too sure that time travelling back to 2009 in terms of both the gameplay and presentation was really part of the plan. Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pixel and welcome to my review of Terminator Resistance right here on the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel. In Terminator Resistance, you play as Private Jacob Rivers, a resistance soldier whose entire division has just been wiped out by a single experimental Skynet infiltration unit. Amongst all the chaos, you somehow manage to escape, but it's not long before you find yourself staring into the glowing red eyes of a T-800. Just before it's able to execute its termination protocol, a mysterious stranger steps in and guides you to safety via a conveniently placed radio. He directs you towards a garage, which is where you first meet Jennifer and Patrick, a pair of bickering siblings that require your assistance in reaching a nearby evacuation point. One thing leads to the next, and before you know it, you are fleeing the city along with a ragtag group of survivors that you end up joining. Once you reach relative safety, you decide that the best course of action will be to try and make contact with Commander Baron, the leader of the Resistance South Division, so that you can warn her about the newfound threat and ultimately assist in bringing down Skynet.
But then I started thinking, who is Private Rivers? And why should I treat him as anything other than the deserter he is?
The story in Terminator Resistance takes place in the run-ups to the events of the first couple of films, meaning that the outcome of the main plot is pretty much already decided. The game is also packed full of fan service, so for that reason I would definitely recommend that anybody that intends to play the game first goes back and watches at least the first couple of movies. Not only to ensure that you don't miss out on any of the awesome little references, but also because I feel the movies offer some much needed context to the in-game story. Since the plot is pretty much already set in stone, the game plays out through a linear series of missions. For the most part, these take place on fairly large semi-open maps that can be explored, scavenged and tackled in multiple ways. Many of these maps also contain a couple of Skynet outposts that can be destroyed and side missions that are usually found just off the beaten track. This sort of mission structure should be instantly familiar to anybody that's invested time in games such as Metro Exodus, Homefront the Revolution, and anything in the Deus Ex franchise. Once you've completed the primary mission within each map, you're no longer able to go back to that area, so it's important that you complete any active side missions, scavenge for any supplies, and clear out any Skynet outposts before progressing the main story. You gain access to most of this side content by chatting to various characters while you're back at your home base or the Resistance shelter between missions. While pretty much all of these bar one don't really have all that much, if any, impact on the overall plot, they can and often do have a measurable effect on the outcome of that individual character, which is definitely worth keeping in mind if you're aiming towards what could be considered to be the best ending.
What do you say? Buddies?
The side missions themselves are unfortunately not all that interesting from a gameplay perspective, often simply requiring that you stop off at a certain location to collect something during your next mission. That said, the side missions do at least have a small but lasting effect on the world. For instance, at one point you are tasked with hunting down some chalk for Patrick. If you succeed, you will start to notice his doodles appearing on the walls around the Resistance shelter. It's a nice little touch that reinforces the idea that your actions are indeed having a positive impact on the world.
Thanks for bringing that chalk. I've been drawing a lot. I'd be so bored without it.
There's even a basic dialogue system here that allows you to ask questions and choose responses. This ties into an appreciation system that dictates how much NPCs like and trust you, which can have major ramifications later down the line. You're also able to listen to various characters' backstories, which are often able to shed some light on the history of the war and how humanity has reached the point that they're at now. The voice acting during these conversations isn't the greatest thing that I've ever heard, but it's certainly not awful. If anything, I would say that the biggest problem here is that the dialogue is just far too clean and well rehearsed. At points, it sounds almost as if you are being spoken at rather than to. This is something that is certainly not helped by the stiff facial animations and neutral body positions that characters will often default to during conversations.
Hey, you're off again? I'll see you later. I'm gonna stay here and help Aaron.
A couple of the female characters can also be, let's just say, romanced. Play your cards right and there is a chance that you will be rewarded with an incredibly awkward first-person sex scene, so just make sure that you're ready to turn down the audio volume if you happen to be using speakers. Now, to be completely honest, while I doubt the game's going to be winning any awards for its story, it's actually fairly decent. It does a great job of sticking within the confines of the lore that's been established by the source material, so if you're a fan of the Terminator franchise, I can confidently say that there's a pretty good chance that you're going to find an awful lot to like here. When it comes to the gameplay though, Terminator Resistance is much more of a mixed bag. The basic combat and movement, while serviceable, do unfortunately feel incredibly dated. Much like your typical first-person shooter, you're able to run, jump, crouch, and even slide. Each of these movements on their own work fine, however when they're used together they lack fluidity, which leaves the controls feeling rather stiff and, well, bland. The combat doesn't exactly fare much better either. You spend much of your first few hours restricted to more traditional human weaponry, and all you'll be fighting is small groups of flying drones and spider scouts, both of which are incredibly weak and boring to fight. And while you do come across a few larger enemies during this time, they're almost always placed right next to giant glowing explosive plasma barrels, so you really need to engage them in direct combat. You won't actually start to encounter the Terminators until you're sent on a mission to an abandoned hospital in the medical district. You're made aware at the start of this mission that your small and medium caliber weaponry is ineffective against them, and so this leads to a rather intense stealth section. Dozens of T-800 units are wandering the building and your options are limited, so you're forced to either sneak by them or think of creative ways to destroy them. Hands down, this section is legitimately really well done. However, a little while later, once you get your hands on your first plasma weapon, all that tension that the developers had done such a good job in building is released and, well, wasted. These Terminators, the ones that you've been ducking and diving to avoid and the ones that are basically portrayed as invincible in the movies, well, they turn out to be just another enemy. While the T-800s are initially able to soak up quite a bit of damage, their slow predictable movement combined with their limited intelligence and accuracy of a blindfolded stormtrooper makes them incredibly easy to manipulate and take down, something that only gets easier the further you progress, no thanks to the ability to upgrade your weapons.
Go clear!
Weapon upgrades are handled via Skynet chips, which you can either pick up off fallen enemies or buy from the quartermaster at the resistance shelter. These are basically percentile buffs that you can apply to the various weapon stats such as damage, fire rate, stability and clip size. Each chip also contains a couple of symbols that need to be matched up in order to ensure compatibility, and each plasma weapon requires 3 of these chips in order to complete the circuit. Personally, I actually really like this concept, so it's unfortunate that it's not been implemented all that well in terms of balance. There is basically no reason to not just double down on damage in most cases, and when you do, the game soon becomes ridiculously easy. Though it has to be said, the issue with difficulty does go a lot deeper than a few concerns regarding overpowered weapon upgrades. Right from the very start of the game, you have access to a pair of ultra vision goggles that allow you to see enemies through walls and other solid objects. They are basically a wall hack that you're able to toggle on and off at will. Surprisingly, the only limitation on their use is that you can't sprint or shoot while they are active, and as a result they are quite simply far too powerful. I would even go as far to call them straight up game breaking in their current state. As powerful as both the weapons and the ultravision goggles are, they still don't manage to spoil the game quite as much as the really shoddy artificial intelligence. I mean, I can appreciate that the T-800s were never designed to be masterminds, and the game does do an awesome job of replicating their movements and mannerisms based on what little footage we see of them in the first 2 movies. However, not only does this not translate to particularly engaging gameplay, but they also appear to have some major limitations that make very little sense. On my first playthrough, I was even able to kill all of the bigger boss type enemies without even having them shoot at me because it was far too easy to avoid their weapons firing line all the time while keeping their weak spots in mind. This could likely be forgiven if you were fighting wave after wave of T-800s, but you won't be. It's almost always going to be just 2 or 3 at a time, and even if there are more of them in the area, it's not like they've got the intelligence to react to what's going on around them, so they just ignore you.
T-47 neutralized.
Not only is this a massive shame in terms of level of challenge on offer, but also because it renders many of the game's most interesting features and mechanics basically pointless. Like I mentioned earlier, many of these missions take place on maps that are large enough to offer a decent amount of flexibility in playstyles. You're often given the opportunity to sneak around and avoid enemies, set up traps and hack turrets, or you can instead opt to play more aggressively. Throughout these environments, you will also be scavenging plenty of trade resources that are converted to cash that can be spent with a quartermaster. You'll also be finding crafting resources such as scrap, fabric and electrical parts that can be used to craft items at one of the game's many crafting stations. Beyond that, you'll also come across lots of weapons and ammo as well as collectibles in the form of notes. Many of these notes actually contain cool little references to the film, so if you're a fan, make sure you keep an eye out for those. There's even a basic progression system here that sees you gaining small amounts of XP for completing missions, killing enemies and blowing stuff up. Each time you level up, you will receive a skill point that can be invested into various skills. Invest in lockpicking and you'll be able to break into higher difficulty locks, or invest in hacking and you'll be able to perform higher difficulty hacks. You get the idea. The lockpicking is pretty much ripped straight out of games like Skyrim and Fallout. It's a simple case of finding the sweet spot while hoping that you don't snap the pick. Hacking, on the other hand, plays out via a minigame which is pretty much the old school classic Frogger, or the decryption minigame from the original Mass Effect. Up until now, I played through the game twice, with my first playthrough being on the extreme difficulty. I've got all the achievements, and I'm pretty sure that I've hacked and broke into every single thing that I possibly could, and yet I've barely used any of the game's cooler looking items, and I've only used the crafting stations to make a few lockpicks at the start of each run. While I'm sure you could argue that I must have been playing the game wrong and it's my own fault that I never got to utilise many of the game's more interesting gadgets and mechanics, I would counter this by pointing out that it's the developer's job to incentivise the use of said features and ensure that the game does not fall victim to a single optimal strategy, which it most certainly does. When you offer the ability to choose between multiple playstyles, you really need to make sure that you're able to balance out the pros and cons of each. If you don't, you end up with a situation like we have here. You see, having options is not the same as having choices. For example, when I approach a busy road in real life, I have the option to stop, look and listen and then cross safely. However, I also have the option to close my eyes, plug my ears and sprint across blindly. These are both very viable options, and yet, let's be honest, we only have one viable choice. It's the same thing here. When you weigh up the pros and cons of combat versus stealth, stealth loses badly, even though I will be the first to admit that stealth probably does offer the path of most enjoyment. To be fair, I don't doubt that there's plenty of gamers out there that have no problem self-imposing restrictions on themselves in order to make the game more enjoyable. I'm just not one of them. As negative as all this sounds, the game as a whole is not actually all that bad. The developers have indeed succeeded in making a decent Terminator game, which is something that we've not really seen in quite some time now. As a side, I also found the game to be incredibly stable. In my 20 plus hours of play, I've not experienced a single crash or come across any serious game-breaking bugs, which, let's be honest, is somewhat of a rarity in 2019. From a presentation perspective, Terminator Resistance is a triumph in some areas while falling a little short in others. The game runs on Unreal Engine 4 and does manage to make good use of some of the engine's more modern rendering features, such as screen space reflections, temporal anti-aliasing, and a heavy use of volumetric effects. The volumetric fog and lighting is massively overdone and exaggerated, just like in the movies, so thematically it works really well. Thankfully, the Unreal Engine offers one of the better volumetric implementations on the market, especially in terms of image stability, meaning that the fog volumes always appear nice, sharp and artifact-free, while remaining fairly performant. I played through the game at 1440p using the Epic Settings preset on our Sapphire Nitro RX 5700 XT, and we only ever dipped below that 60 FPS target a handful of times, and even then not by much. All the footage in this video was recorded using that graphics card. Visually, Terminator Resistance does a great job of capturing that iconic look from the future scenes in the first couple of movies, but that's not to say it's perfect. When you take a closer look, it soon becomes apparent that many of the individual assets are not all that detailed, and the animations in particular do look very dated, which is most likely due to most of them being hand animated rather than using motion capture. There's also a lot of post-processing going on, which gives you that typical Unreal Engine look that I'm not really a massive fan of. The overall image just ends up looking much softer than it probably should, and it requires you going into the game's config files in order to remove certain effects, which is never fun. Certain forms of lighting and shadows also appear to be a little bit off. It's nothing too serious, but it does seem like the first person torch, for instance, lacks the ability to cast shadows, which games have been doing for well over a decade now, and often objects don't feel planted in their surroundings due to a weak form of ambient occlusion. Nighttime maps do appear to fare better in terms of their lighting than the daytime missions that all look a little bit off. I just can't really put my finger on it, it's almost as if there's something missing from the rendering pipeline. One aspect of the presentation that the game totally nails is the audio. Both the music and the sound effects are pretty much spot on, with the plasma weapons sounding like they could have very well been ripped directly out of the movies, and the soundtrack not only managing to capture the magic of the movies, but in some respects even exceeding it. I'm not usually somebody that pays too much attention to music in games, but this right here is some really impressive stuff. Considering the budget restrictions, since this is not a AAA release by any stretch of the imagination, I believe that the developers have done a very respectable job with the presentation. The majority of the game's shortcomings would most likely cost an awful lot more money to improve, especially when it comes to stuff like animations. So, with everything taken into consideration, what's my verdict? Well, if I was reviewing this back in 2009, obviously ignoring the technical features that wouldn't have been available back then I would have most likely said that Terminator Resistance is a pretty good game, or maybe even a great game. However, today in 2019, it's simply not too bad. And if you're a big fan of the source material, then maybe you could even consider it to be a very good game and most likely worth picking up. To be clear, I don't want to take anything away from these developers. This game is obviously a massive step up from their previous works, and it's easy to see that they put a lot of love and effort into this project. Unfortunately though, I can't just rate a game based solely on their intentions, and for that reason, I have to give Terminator Resistance a respectable 3 out of a possible 5 stars. Now, I hope that you all enjoyed this video. If you're new around here, please do consider slapping that subscribe button and dinging that bell so you get notified of our future uploads. If you like this kind of content, then you can leave us a like, and if you disliked it, there's a button for that too, and all we ask is that you let us know why you disliked it so we can try and improve in future. If you've got any questions, suggestions, or feedback, please leave it down in the comment section below and I will try and get back to you. With all that said, from myself and everybody here at the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I will catch you later. Bye bye.